Book discussion, Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoi. Happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are all unhappy in their own way. This iconic opening of a book, I think it summarizes the book. And I think that's actually one of the main characteristics of the two big Russian writers of the second half of the 19th century, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Like, they have this ability to say everything with a title or with a few words. So in a sense, they're poets, even though ironically they wrote very long books. So Anna Karenina, of course, is the name, but War and Peace, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment, all these types of books, I think have one thing in common, is they have incredibly strong titles. And this is not a title, this is the opening of the book, but it just summarizes, in my opinion, what Anna Karenina is all about. So I'm going to focus in this discussion on the impact that this book had on me. This is not a critique, a literary critique. This is not a book review, none of that stuff. Please, there's many sources for that, particularly when it comes to classic literature like Tolstoy. What this is just my impression, what I took away. And since this is in the context of the Not Even Wrong podcast, I also want to emphasize why we're doing this and why I am incredibly pleased actually to discuss this book today. So first, we're doing this here, this podcast series is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. That's the goal. And why are we discussing books? Well, because that's part of the hedge fund business, right? Reading books is not just a pastime, a hobby. It is part of the business. We've discussed this in episodes before, so I'm not going to go into deeper explanations, but just think about it this way. When you go to the gym, you're doing a lot of stuff. You exercise. Let's say you're an MMA fighter. You are going to actually spar and train real fighting, but you're also going to do strength and conditioning, and you're going to do yoga. And I think literature is kind of like that. Whether it's yoga or strength and conditioning, I'm going to leave that up to other people to discuss. But it's the kind of training that you have to do. It's the training that is not going to get you direct impact on a particular fight in the case of the MMA person, or if you're a football player, it might not have direct impact on the game next weekend, but it overall has huge benefits if you do it right. So that's the idea of literature. It's yoga for the mind, strength and conditioning for the mind, and I think Anna Karenina is a perfect example. So the book to me has one big insight that I took away from the book, and that is that happy families are all alike because they follow an organic, natural process of life that is beyond reason, that is not constrained by human judgment and reason. And the big unhappy family, which is the unhappy families are all unhappy in their own ways, they have their own reasons. Now, I would argue that as a sort of global situation, you could argue they're also all unhappy in the same way because they actually neglect the organic potential of humans. What I mean by that is, and I want to relate this actually to an academic paper that recently we discussed, which is the Age of Experience, or the Era of Experience by Richard Sutton. So we actually see a really good combination of Sutton and his idea of intelligence, and Tolstoy and his idea of life. And if you just equate life with intelligence, then you can see how these two ideas actually converge. And there is actually a very nice academic paper that came out, I think, by MIT, where they talk about the Anna Karenina idea of intelligence. So some sort of all intelligence is alike, and that's just a Platonic representation of intelligence. I'm not going to go into that paper here, but I want to stay a little bit with Sutton and Tolstoy and compare the two, and use this also as a basis for discussing the book. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's August 19, 2025. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is down 2%. The market's down 1%. For the year, we are down 9.9%. The market is up 9%. We're outperforming by 18.9%. So let me just real quick talk about the book and then compare it to actually the era of experience, and hopefully bring across the message that we took from the book and the idea and the inspiration we took from the book. So Anna Karenina is a epic novel about Russian society in the second half of the 19th century. It follows several families. It follows the love story and also the opposite of it, the tragedies of the families. It's a really nice, very classic book in a sense that it also, in my opinion, is a beautiful historic novel. So it gives you a sense for how society was back then. And if you're a history student, particularly if you're interested in 19th century Russian history, I think you're going to learn a lot by reading a book like that. But let's get to the gist of what's going on here. Anna Karenina is a book about happiness, and a book about life, and a book about what life and happiness actually mean. And that's why it starts with happiness. And that's really the gist of the book. So this is a fundamental treatise on how people live together, what makes them happy, and the reasons for why they're unhappy. And I think fundamentally, you have Levin and Kitty, and then you have Alexei and Karenina, and of course Oblonsky, the lover of Karenina. And the reason that one side of this equation is happy and the other is unhappy is because Levin is an organic person. He is following his own instincts and his emotions, and he is not confining himself to reason, despite the pressure that he feels, the societal pressure, and also his own internal pressure to follow what, let's say, Christianity and society is indoctrinating him to do. So there's a lot of nice passages towards the end. In particular, he talks about philosophy. He talks about the idea that, let's say, moral philosophy makes a lot of sense if you follow the strict definitions of the words. But if you abstract from the definitions of the words, it stops making sense because it doesn't give you a real understanding of life. The only thing you can understand from life is if you live it and actually follow its trajectory. And now, to use Richard Sutton's experience, or explanation, if you follow experience, and if you, to use a technical term, if you compile in runtime, so you don't actually have any preconceived idea of society, you don't let yourself be guided by reason, you follow your instinct, you follow the emotions, and you follow the rewards that you get with the ultimate goal of love and goodness. That's the idea. And that's up for discussion if that is the right goal. But one of the biggest questions I have for Sutton and his area of experience is, how do you set the goals? And Tolstoy actually has an answer for that. It's love and goodness. If that is your ultimate goal, if you want to be good in this world, and whatever that means, of course, that in itself requires explanations, but you could argue that if you put love and goodness as the fundamental trajectory that you follow, that all your reward functions that you actually develop yourself, all your features, all your options, whatever technical terms you want to use, in layman terms, it just means that if you're a person that goes through life and you make decisions whether what to do next and how to reward yourself internally, of course, morally, with your actions, or in other words, how to decide what's a good action, what's a bad action. If you have this overarching goal of goodness and love, you might end up in a good place, even though maybe in the near term, the trajectory might look very different. So that's, I think, the biggest takeaway I have from this book. I think there's a lot of passages that support this thesis, particularly towards the end when Tolstoy talks about, when Levin's character is involved in metaphysics and philosophy, and he's trying to understand, let's say, what Christianity tells him about right and wrong. He's a firm believer in right and wrong, but he's also a firm believer in that right and wrong is not confined to Christianity. It's certainly not confined to the Russian society that defines right and wrong. For example, going to war against Turkey is the right thing to do. Well, who says that, right? And I think we have a lot of echo today with our own society, where people take it upon themselves to claim that, this, the American people want this, and this is good for black people, and this is good for women, and this is good for whatever, suppressed minority, when in fact maybe those people actually don't feel like that. So there's, again, the Arab experience or the Anna Karenina way of living, or if you will, the transcending human judgment and human knowledge. That is the way to go. Now, the big question that Tolstoy is not really answering for me, and that pretty much nobody is actually answering for me, even Sutton, is, okay, look, if we follow this trajectory, like in Sutton's presentation that he gave recently at the Singularity Conference in Iceland, videos in the show notes, he talks about the design space and the runtime space. The design space is sort of what we call training. Or if you want to use, back to Anna Karenina, it would be like what society sort of, what are the rules and habits of society? The knowledge, the college education, the societal knowledge that you have, that's design space. Runtime space is experience. That's what Levin talks about when he says that, for example, love and love thy neighbor and empathy and forgiveness and all of these things, they would not arise from a rational mind. They only arise through experience. So that's runtime intelligence. And Sutton talks about this in the context of AI, and Tolstoy talks about this in the context of the human condition. They both talk about the same thing. And of course, if you convert human condition with intelligence, you could say they talk the exactly same thing. The human condition is, the condition of an intelligence, which is the biological intelligence of humans, and that condition is driven by experience. Now the question is, what is the prior? Like, do we need any kind of knowledge? Can we just come with a total blank slate? Or is there such a thing as a prior, a knowledge required to actually bootstrap ourselves into an area of experience? I think that is an open question. For me, that's an open question, because I do believe that we have priors, we have knowledge that we build upon. I mean, the ability to do addition and subtraction, I think, is knowledge that is not confining us to make conclusions that are maybe not optimal. The knowledge of even responding to rewards, even that in itself, that type of knowledge, that type of intelligence is something we need to have a reinforcement learning-based agent. So in other words, also back to Tolstoy, if we believe in a world of less rationality, less reason, and more experience and instinct, well, isn't that knowledge in itself too? What role does memory play? Like, how much do we want to store, and how much do we just keep grinding? And do we even store? Like, how much of the knowledge that we acquire in the process of, let's say, runtime intelligence, like, do we store that knowledge? How does that work? And I guess Sutton has some explanations for that. Like, he calls it options. Options are solutions to problems. Problems are created by expanding features. So he talks about the monkey that swings and enjoys swinging, and then learns how to swing, and then learns how to maybe swing in the different types of wood and forests, and and then learns how to escape maybe snakes while he's swinging. So all these are problems that arise because new features are required, and therefore new options are created, new solutions to problems. And the question then occurs also, well, okay, if we have an agent that is continuously learning, how much of that learning do we actually store? Maybe the answer is everything, but then how do we deal with memory? And we humans actually have a memory that is has evolved to discard that what's not so important. Sutton has a similar concept in his work about continual backprop, where he actually discards weights that don't have much contribution to the model, or in other words, where the ReLU function doesn't get any positive results from the outgoing weights. Back to Karenina, though, I don't want to get too technical here. I really just wanted to get a big picture interpretation of the book as an idea of not being too much confined with the human experience and the human side of knowledge, and trying to use all the experience that we have as humans, particularly emotions and the instincts, as a guide towards our actions. That's what happy families do. Levin has done a lot of things that society might not have considered appropriate. He was also the one who actually made an offer to Kitty very early on. She refused him for Oblonsky because she was also under the impression that Oblonsky is the better deal, when it turns out he wasn't. And I think the canonical example of being stuck and stubborn and focused too much on societal conventions is, Karenina's husband, Alexei, who is so rigid and so focused on the conventions that he kills his own wife, even though he's trying to be good. But within that goodness, which is not confined in organic, emotional, human, or natural experience, it's cerebral. He's good because that's what Christianity tells him to be. It doesn't count, and Anna doesn't buy it, and it eventually destroys her. Now, what really destroys her is not necessarily her husband, it's actually Oblonsky himself, who ends up acting probably normal as a man who has an affair with a married woman. He probably has a certain distance towards her, even though he loves her, and she herself became, in my opinion, just a obsessed woman, and she killed herself. Now, her role in this book is, I would say, it's a little bit, she's the monster that stares into the abyss, and then the abyss, she's the person that stares too deep into the abyss, and then the abyss stares back. Like, she starts out as a admirable person, a personality, a woman that you want to be around. She's good looking, she's well regarded in society, she's fun. But then she also isn't free, and she tries to free herself from her husband, Alexei. She does that, she gets free, she falls in love with Oblonsky, she actually has a nice time with him. They travel around in Europe, they have a good time, they have money, things are good. And it turns out that she ends up destroying herself by asking for too much. And I wouldn't call her cerebral, but she wasn't following the right instincts. I guess her reward function, if you will go back to the AI analogy, her reward function wasn't functioning properly. Something went wrong there. Because if the goal was goodness and happiness, she had it. She had the ability, for example, humility. Give your husband some freedom. Let him be free. Give him the horses. Give him maybe not affairs, but a man needs to do what a man needs to do. In order to love a woman, a man needs to do what a man needs to do, and that sometimes it does not involve the woman. So she wasn't able to convey that. I think Kitty is much better at that, and of course Levin, he is the protagonist that characterizes this way of life of organic, natural evolution that in the context of AI is depicted really well with The Era of Experience by Richard Sutton. So to summarize, again, I mean, this is not a book review by any means. So if you want to have a literary review, you should consider all the other thousands and thousands of good reviews that are out there about this book. It's a classic. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. For me, it has the most important impact is that it solidifies this idea of the era of experience. It solidifies the idea of runtime intelligence, the ability to continuously learn, the ability not to be constrained by human judgment, and also the necessity to leave outcomes and rewards open, but have a common goal. That is important. And that common goal has to be it has to be substrate independent. In other words, it can't be confined on to religions, nations, none of that stuff. These are all human constructs. But happiness and goodness aren't. Thank you.